This is the contemporary European security system, and this is class number 12, which is on Russia. The title, Russia, a security problem for Europe, ? And as ever, whenever we focus on a particular country, I think it's worth taking a look at the geography. I think geography is a very important feature when thinking about the particular security challenges different states have and the sorts of foreign and security policies that they have a tendency to pursue. A couple of points to make about Russia. First of all, as this map shows, Russia is big. So obviously, Russia is both a European and an Asian country. So looking at the map here, we sort of stretches from the European part of Russia, so obviously Moscow, far to Russia, far to the far western part of Russia. In fact, it's worth mentioning that virtually all Russia's big population centers, its major cities, are located in the European part. As you go further and further east, in terms of the population, it becomes progressively sparser. So, there's a very clear contrast between the western part of Russia, which is very heavily populated and, contains lots and lots of towns and cities. And then you stretch out across the Siberian plain, the Siberian plateau, right into the eastern part of Russia. And for obvious reasons, this part of Russia is not very heavily populated, simply because the conditions are very inhospitable. Southern Asia, you do have, towns, population settlements, not far from Mongolia, the Chinese border. Even there, though, in contrast to Europe, as I say, the European part, there isn't all that many people. So a large part of Russia is pretty empty, and that's worth bearing in mind. Nonetheless, huge country. And another thing that is worth noting, partly because of its size, of course, is that Russia has frontiers with a fairly large number of states. So you kind of contrast Russia with a country like Canada. Canada, obviously the world's second largest country in terms of land area. But Canada really only shares one frontier, that with the United States. And historically, of course, the United States has not been really much of a threat, not in the 20th century anyway, or the 21st. The United States has not really represented a significant challenge to Canadian security. In contrast, Russia, another huge geographical area, but one which is surrounded by lots and lots of different countries. So obviously you have the European part of Russia, which has frontiers with countries like Finland, Belarus, Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. But which then kind of extends down into the Caucasus. And then you've got Russia bordering on southern Asia, so the various stans, as we call it, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., etc., Uzbekistan. Then Russia also shares a frontier with China, and we might talk a little bit more about that a bit later on. But essentially, Russia has another major great power right on its frontier in a way that the United States does not. Mongolia as well, which parts of Mongolia historically have been sort of fallen into the Russian sphere of influence, or the old Soviet sphere of influence. So yeah, a number of countries. And historically, relations between Russia and these countries have tended to be quite problematic. And then, of course, you've got the United States. And again, it's something that we tend to forget. But both Russia and the United States are also in pretty close proximity. Admittedly, the two parts of both Russia and the United States are pretty desolate, meaning there aren't many people there, the environmental conditions here. So the United States, obviously, pointing up there, this bit is the tip of Alaska. You have the Bering Strait separating the two countries. Although large part of the year, this strait can actually be frozen. So it is actually physically possible to walk from Russia into the United States, at least in certain parts of the year. So Alaska in very kind of close proximity to Russia. So again, it's something that we tend to forget. As I say, of course, the two parts of both the United States and Russia. There's nobody living there. It's very, very close to the Arctic Circle. But yeah, I mean, Russia's geography obviously presents it with a number of security challenges, but it also, I suppose, presents Russia with a number of opportunities when it comes to projecting its influence. But I think a sort of constant part of the narrative, if you like, of Russian history is that there has been a general tendency, I think, inside Russia to think in terms of Russia being encircled by other powers. Historically, Russia has had other major powers either on its frontier or very close to its frontier. Obviously, Germany in the 20th century at various junctures proved a major threat to Russian security. More recently, China, during the Cold War at least, became a significant security challenge. And then, of course, you've got American military bases, which again, the Russians have seen as a threat, and there have been accusations that the United States and NATO has attempted to encircle Russia. If anything, in recent years, these accusations have become even more strident. So during the Cold War, obviously, the United States had a very, very strong presence in Western Europe. Since the Cold War came to an end, obviously, NATO has expanded further eastwards. Russia, and again, we'll talk a little bit about this later in today's lecture, but Russia has been deeply concerned about Western influence extending into Ukraine. I suppose the nightmare scenario from the Russian point of view would be for Ukraine to become a NATO member, and that you might have actual American military bases right on close to the Russian frontier in that part of the year. Similarly, Russia has not at all happy about the fact that the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have joined NATO and are also part of the European Union, which again brings these countries which basically brings NATO right onto Russia's frontiers. Scandinavia as well. Norway was obviously a founding member of NATO, so NATO from the beginning has had a presence in Scandinavia. Sweden and Finland, two countries which are neutral, although both of these now belong to the European Union, and both and Finland and Norway share a frontier with Russia. The Norwegian frontier is very small, but it does basically touch Russia in the north there. So you've got the kind of European, then the Caucasus, which since the end of the Cold War, Russia has kind of experienced challenges in maintaining order and maintaining a strong presence in that particular region. Then you've got, as I say, the various stans: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, All these countries, obviously, first of all of them used to belong to all of them were part of the Soviet Union. So these are post-Soviet countries, and all of them obviously have large Muslim populations, and they too have sort of represented something of a challenge to Russian security over the years. Okay, a quick headline which I found fairly recently. This was on the 10th of April, so about just over a month ago. Trump, Putin speak for a second consecutive day. President Trump on Friday spoke with the Russian President Vladimir Putin for the second time in as many days, discussing oil production and the coronavirus epidemic. The relationship between Trump and Vladimir Putin, that has attracted an awful lot of interest and has been very controversial, and we might discuss this in a bit more detail towards the end. But obviously, the American-Russian relationship in the post-Cold War period, this is something that a lot of people have focused on and have written about. I think it's fair to say that under Vladimir Putin, Russia now views the United States as an adversary and a potential threat to Russian interests. I think it's also fair to say that under Putin, Russia, certainly in recent years, probably in the last decade actually, but Russia has begun to pursue a much more assertive policy in various parts of the world, which actually brings me on to the next slide. Cartoon here showing Vladimir Putin. Actually, it wasn't the cartoon I was expecting, but so this is obviously a reference to Russia's seizure of the Crimea in 2014. After that occurred, a referendum was actually organised in Crimea, asking the people there whether they wanted to continue not really continue, but whether they wanted to be part of Russia. The cartoon here saying, President Putin, can you have a free and fair referendum in Crimea when it's under virtual military occupation? Sure. Hands up all who think I'm right. So essentially questioning the validity of the referendum that was held in Crimea in 2014. Okay, a couple of things to say. As ever, our main reading, Cotty's book, which was published a few years ago. I think the chapter does say some relevant things about Russian foreign policy, which is why I'm still using it. But obviously, it sort of needs to be brought up to date. So I'll make I will add some sort of observations that in terms of Russian foreign policy in the last few years. But the chapter begins with different Russian foreign policy approaches. So when the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union collapses at the beginning of the 1990s, I suppose there were various views inside Russia as to the sort of foreign policy approach that Russia should adopt. Cotty suggests that there were 4 distinct Russian strategies available. First was, if you like, a pro-Western strategy, and that basically envisaged Russia joining various Western institutions, perhaps one day even becoming a member of the European Union or something like that. So this was, if you like, a sort of pro-Western strategy. And I think it's fair to say that initially, under Boris Yeltsin and his first governments, this strategy was taken seriously. Second, Cotty characterized this as a sort of moderate liberal strategy, so less pro-Western than the first, but nonetheless, this as the third point on the PowerPoint here says. This is this idea that Russia should pursue a pragmatic approach based on Russian national interests, but certainly not ruling out the idea of cooperation with Western institutions and Western governments. But nonetheless, Russian foreign policy essentially being animated by its own particular interests, however they were to be defined. Third, moderate conservative strategy who wanted to re-establish Russian influence over the former Soviet territories. I think broadly Putin sort of fits into this category now. I would say certainly in the last 10, 15 years or so. I think Putin comes into this area more or less. Certainly this desire to reassert Russian influence over various states that once were part of the Soviet Union. I think that is certainly uppermost in Putin's mind. Fourth, nationalists and neo-communists who want to re-establish the Russian Empire. I think critics of Putin might say that there are elements of this fourth strategy. I mean, certainly one of the most striking things about Russia under Putin is that to some extent Russia has sort of rediscovered its Tsarist past. So Putin in particular certainly enjoys using the iconography of the Tsarist Empire. So if you look at Russian soldiers now, their uniforms don't look that dissimilar to the uniforms of the old Imperial Russian army. Putin has a very kind of close relationship with the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, again, which obviously played a very strong role in Imperial Russia. So things like that. So there is sort of an aspect of Putin where he is seemingly trying to reinvent himself as a kind of Russian Tsar, or at least associate his government or his regime with those sorts of values from the past. Okay, let's just do a little bit of the history. So this slide talks about some of the main events of Russia in the 1990s. Obviously, Boris Yeltsin was the first Russian president of a post-communist Russia. So the Soviet Union collapses end of 1991. In fact, it's Yeltsin, along with other leaders of Soviet republics, who basically engineer this dissolution at the end of the year. In doing so, effectively, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was basically president of the Soviet Union by this stage, he'd sort of left the Communist Party after the August coup in 1991. But in dissolving the Soviet Union, basically Gorbachev loses his job, and Yeltsin, by default almost, becomes sort of president of a new independent Russia, the Russian Federation. And as I said, I mean, talking about the different traditions, I think the Yeltsin in the early 1990s, so really 92, 93, very much cast himself as a pro-Western leader. His prime ministers in this time tended to be liberal reformers. So I think there was a general sense that Russia was going to pursue a policy in which it would reform itself, liberalize its economy, and start a process of integrating itself into Western institutions. On the other hand, Yeltsin, although he becomes president of Russia, for a year or two, they actually continue with the old Soviet constitution. And one of the problems with that is that the Russian parliament, the Duma at this time, was basically dominated by, this gets slightly confusing, I say they're conservative forces, but essentially we're talking about conservative communists, if that makes sense. Essentially, those elements who wanted to sort of conserve, if you like, the old Soviet regime, and who were against the sort of liberalizing policies of Yeltsin and his governments in the early 1990s. So there's a sort of political collision which culminates in a major political crisis in 1993. Effectively, the Duma revolts against Yeltsin's regime. Yeltsin responds by sending in the Russian army to dissolve the Duma and round up the sort of conservative leadership. He then rewrites the Russian constitution, Yeltsin, and the new constitution basically places an awful lot of power in the hands of the Russian president. So if you look at the constitution more or less survives to this day. But if you look at the constitution, there is no real sense of checks and balances. As an awful lot of power is basically concentrated in the hands of the Russian presidents. So essentially, the president has the power to hire and fire various prime ministers, has the power to dissolve the Duma, the Russian parliament, almost when the president feels necessary. Things like that. So as I say, Yeltsin becomes this very sort of dominant figure, but he also becomes extremely unpopular by the mid-1990s, to the point at which it looks almost certain that he will lose the 1996 election. There's the two rival candidates, communist candidate and a nationalist candidate, seem to be sort of gaining ground. As I say, Yeltsin becomes extremely unpopular, and there are real fears that Yeltsin will be replaced by a much more extreme figure in 96. However, Yeltsin sort of recovers, mounts a very sort of strong election campaign. Yeltsin has basically all the television news media on side, so essentially Vladimir Putin today is using the same sort of playbook as Yeltsin used in 96, and Yeltsin wins. He manages to secure a second term. In his second term, though, it's becoming increasingly apparent that Yeltsin is not a well man. It's also becoming increasingly apparent that he has a drinking problem. And I suppose it's in the late 90s that you see the oligarchs emerge as a really powerful political force in Russian politics. I think it's fair to say Yeltsin's regime becomes increasingly corrupt, hit by various scandals. You also have a major sort of conflict breaking out in Chechnya in the mid-90s, which does not go at all well for the Russian army. So you get a general sense of a sort of mounting crisis in Russia. And then, of course, in 1998, Russia is very badly hit by the Asian financial crisis. So, by the late 90s, Russia is not looking in good shape. And it's in 99 that Yeltsin chooses a relatively obscure figure, Vladimir Putin, whose rise in Russian politics is pretty meteoric during the 90s. In 1989, Putin is basically a very obscure colonel in the KGB. He's based in East Germany after the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. Putin has to leave, moves to St. Petersburg, basically becomes the right-hand man of the mayor of St. Petersburg, sort of rises through the ranks there, and then towards, I think it's in late 90s, he's sort of transferred to Moscow, becomes part of the Russian government, continues his rise, and finally catches the eye of Yeltsin in 99, who appoints him as prime minister. As prime minister, Putin launches a second war against Chechnya, which goes much better, although it's an extremely brutal campaign that the Russian army launches. But nonetheless, he manages to sort of quell the resistance in that region, impose a degree of order, and Putin becomes increasingly sort of popular in the eyes of the Russian public. He also manages to sort of stabilize the economic situation. Yeltsin has a succession of prime ministers throughout the 1990s, but by 99, and as I say, Putin almost kind of comes out of the blue, really. But by 99, it's becoming apparent that essentially Yeltsin is grooming Putin to be his successor. And then Yeltsin makes a surprise announcement, New Year's Eve, 1999, that he is going to resign and that Vladimir Putin is going to take over as acting president. It seems as though, in fact, I think it's more than seems, it's almost certain that a kind of deal was struck between Yeltsin and Putin, whereby Yeltsin would sort of retire, Putin would take over. In return, Putin gave Yeltsin assurances that neither Yeltsin nor his family would be prosecuted for various sort of crimes, or there were various investigations in terms of corruption involving the Yeltsin family. So Putin basically tells Yeltsin, don't worry, I'll protect you. And Putin basically adheres to this deal. Yeltsin is allowed to basically go into retirement, and of course, a few years later, he eventually dies. But neither he nor his family are really corruption charges in this period. Okay, Putin then, as I say, takes over as president of Russia, beginning of 2000. And I think it's fair to say that if you had told people in 2000 that Putin would still be president 20 years later, I think they would have been quite surprised. But obviously Putin has, as president, has very much managed to kind of consolidate his position. He has, in fact, actually been characterized as being the most powerful man in the world. Powerful in the sense, not obviously Russia itself is not a particularly powerful country, and we will get onto that in a moment. But we're back to the point I made earlier about the Russian constitution and the fact that it confers so much power in the hands of the Russian president. As I say, you contrast Putin's position with that of an American president, where there is, ostensibly anyway, the system of checks and balances and things like that. There is nothing really like that in the Russian constitution. So Putin, as I say, in some ways, you could describe him as the sort of most powerful man in the world. Also possibly one of the richest men in the world. And again, we will get onto that. But also incredibly popular. And as I say, Putin takes over in beginning of the 2000s, and essentially he sort of offers the Russian people stability and also economic security. And some writers have talked about almost a social contract between Putin and, if you like, the Russian middle classes, where he says, I'll let you, I will basically provide you with a kind of economic well-being. You'll be able to get reasonably rich. In return, don't ask too many questions about corruption or, the electoral practices or things like that. So I think it's fair to say, I think it would be fair to characterize Putin today as pretty much an authoritarian leader. I mean, Russia, the political system in Russia today is sort of described in various different ways, sort of semi-authoritarian or an illiberal democracy, things like that. But I think, the general tendency in Russia over the years is for Russia to have become increasingly, as I say, authoritarian in its makeup. Okay, quickly move through some of the other points on this PowerPoint. Russia is an energy superpower, of course. So the Russian economy relies very heavily on gas and oil exports. In that sense, if you look at the sort of structure of the Russian economy, it's not dissimilar to a third world state. So essentially, Russia relies extremely heavily on exporting its commodities in terms of earning foreign exchange. That means that there's certainly been periods in which Russia has become a comparatively rich state. So during Putin's first years as president, the oil prices were pretty high. A lot of money was coming in. The standard of living in Russia seemed to be increasing. As I said, the middle classes were doing pretty well. The problem, though, in terms of relying so heavily on these sorts of energy exports, is that it makes Russia extremely vulnerable when there are changes on when the global markets sort of change. And Russia has certainly suffered on a couple of occasions when oil prices have dropped, and it's suffering at the moment as a consequence of that. So yes, although oil and gas certainly generates a lot of over the years has generated an awful lot of money for Russia. As I say, its dependence on these sorts of exports has made the Russian economy very, very vulnerable to changes in price, especially changes in oil price on the international markets. Third point, I think we mentioned this alright. Russia has the trappings of democracy, but Putin dominates all aspects of the Russian government. I think we all know that. And it's interesting. I mean, when Putin initially comes to power, I think there are certainly hopes in the West that he will be a sort of reformer, a sort of pragmatic reformer. And I think initially, at least, Putin sort of does make statements which suggest that he does want to sort of work with the West, that he is, if you like, a sort of more pragmatic leader. And I think this is especially apparent after 9/11, when Putin very much does reach out to the West and says, look, I can be a partner with you in terms of the global war on terror. Of course, Putin sort of has his own problems with radical Islamic groups in Chechnya and in other parts of Russia and the ex-Soviet Union. So in that sense, Putin thinks that potentially there is a sort of common interest for the West and Russia, as I say, in terms of fighting radical Islamic terrorism. However, this sort of improvement in Russia's relations with America and Western Europe, that is relatively short-lived, not least because as America pursues its war on terror, Russia under Putin becomes increasingly critical of America's policies, not least during the run-up to the Iraq War, 2002-2003, Putin, along with Germany and France, as I mentioned in previous classes, kind of very much comes out in opposition of the American invasion there. As I said a moment ago, I mean, in terms of Russia's relations with the West, these have tended to sort of change, or tended to there have been periods of kind of where the relationship has been reasonably good, other periods in which there have been very clear and acute tensions between Russia and Western states. The first point here, Russia was reliant on economic support in the 1990s. So in terms of sort of reconstructing the Russian economy after almost 8 decades or 7 decades of communist rule, that was a huge challenge and did require a lot of kind of Western investment. I think one of the criticisms in Russia, though, in the 90s was that the West didn't give enough, that there wasn't enough Western support, and some in the West share this view. There's a feeling that perhaps Russia was a sort of lost opportunity in the 1990s, that more Western support could have helped to transform the Russian economy, improve conditions in Russia, and perhaps have led to a more kind of stable government. So I mean, as I said, there is an awful lot of kind of economic and financial involvement on the part of the West in Russian affairs in the 90s. The second point, though, yet many in Russia continue to view Western states as a threat to Russian interests. So I think it's fair to say, even under Yeltsin in the early 1990s, there's still a sort of lingering suspicion of the West. There's still, still a feeling that perhaps the West might actually be encroaching on Western interests. These feelings become even more pronounced in the mid to late 90s for several reasons. First of all, you have the issue of NATO enlargement. 99, 3 Eastern European countries, or Central and Eastern European countries, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, join NATO. There are further enlargements, of course, at the beginning of the 21st century. So basically, NATO begins to expand in Eastern Europe. The Russians deeply unhappy about this. In fact, there's a feeling inside Russia that when the Cold War comes to an end, the United States had promised Russia that NATO would not enlarge eastward. So there's a feeling that the West are sort of reneging on promises that they had made at the end of the Cold War. An even bigger source of concern for the Russians is NATO's interventions in Yugoslavia. So there's a brief bombing campaign against Serbia in '95 to bring the war in Bosnia to an end. But much more serious is the '99 Kosovo War, which leads to a sustained bombing campaign. About 11 weeks, I think, NATO effectively goes to war against Serbia in an effort to try and bring the atrocities that were being committed in Kosovo to an end. Serbia, of course, a Russian ally, or a friend of Russia, so the Russians very much objected to this intervention. The Russians do actually send peacekeeping forces into Kosovo when the war finally comes to an end. So there is an element of cooperation. Nonetheless, many Russians, especially Putin, and I think this is quite significant for what comes later, but many Russians are deeply unhappy about the Western intervention. There's a feeling that kind of NATO and the United States are basically sort of trampling over Russian interests in the region. That they don't have enough regard for Russian interests in the region. As I mentioned earlier, a perennial source of concern for Russia is this idea of potential encirclement. Russia has remained outside the Euro-Atlantic security community, so obviously Russia is not within NATO, it's not within the European Union, so it's sort of excluded from this security community. So that, I think, has contributed to sort of them and us feeling on the part of the Russians. Russia has remained significantly weaker than Western states, and again, I think that's worth bearing in mind. And we'll talk about some of these weaknesses a little bit later. Russia's relationship with NATO. The first point, Russia's links with NATO were increasingly institutionalized since the end of the Cold War, and I think that's significant. As I say, NATO, as we mentioned in previous classes, NATO does not disappear when the Cold War comes to an end. Although the 1991 London NATO conference attempts to restructure NATO in a way that is less threatening, let's say, to Russian interests. So there's a kind of concerted effort, if you like, to try and improve NATO's relationship with Russia. One of the ways they do that is to create various institutions, which allows the Russians to have some sort of consultative role within NATO. So there's a few examples of that. One is that NATO establishes a new program called Partnership for Peace, which is all about trying to coordinate NATO's policies with other non-NATO members. Partnership for Peace for some countries ultimately becomes a stepping stone to NATO membership. This is obviously true of Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe, which eventually become part of NATO. But it also creates relations with countries which aren't likely to be NATO members. And one of them, of course, is Russia. 1997, you have a NATO-Russia Founding Act on Mutual Relations, and on mutual relations, cooperation and security assigned, which again gives Russia some kind of formal presence. This is then upgraded into a NATO-Russia Council in 2002. So there is, a permanent Russian representative based in NATO headquarters. Obviously, the idea is for there to be, consultation, cooperation to try and reduce tensions between NATO and Russia. But despite all of this, I think it's fair to say that the Russian military and Putin ultimately has continued to view NATO as a significant threat to Russian security interests. As we've already mentioned, NATO's expansion into Eastern and Central Europe has been viewed by Russia as being unnecessarily provocative. So there's a feeling that, since the Cold War has come to an end, the West, through NATO and to some extent the European Union, has tried to sort of project its influence into the kind of post-communist sphere in a way that the Russians have not liked. As we already mentioned, Russia was sympathetic towards Serbia in the 1990s and was aggrieved when NATO intervened in Yugoslavia in 95 and 99. And again, we'll come back to some of the consequences of that in a moment. And then you've got Russia's relations with the European Union. In his book, Coty sort of makes the argument that the Russians have viewed the European Union as significantly less threatening than NATO. So the Russians have not objected to the European Union or the expansion of the EU into Eastern Europe in quite the same way as they disliked NATO's expansion. I should say Coty's book was published, I think, in about 2007. Things have moved on since then, and we will get onto that. I think one of the reasons why maybe in the 2000s that the Russians were less concerned about EU enlargement than they were with NATO enlargement was that the EU was, and to some extent still is, a civilian power. It did not have a very strong defence or military arm to its organisation, unlike NATO, which of course is primarily a security organisation. So certainly in the 90s and the 2000s, various agreements, cooperation agreements were struck between the European Union and Russia. Again, relations between the EU and Russia also became institutionalized. So the second point here talks about the twice yearly meetings between Russian and European leaders. As I say, Coty has made the point that Russia views EU expansion as less threatening to its interests than NATO expansion. There were, though, in various ways, though, the EU was still thought to sort of impinge upon Russian interests in various ways. So the fourth point there, expansion of the Schengen area in the, into Eastern Europe, made it harder for Russian citizens to travel into the region. So, as a consequence of countries like Poland becoming EU members, suddenly Russian citizens were required to get visas and things like that in order to travel into this part of the world. Then you've got the issue of Kaliningrad, a Russian enclave bordering Poland, Ukraine, Baltic states. That has also sort of created problems between Russia and the EU, not least in terms of allowing Russian citizens to travel through EU countries, traveling from Kaliningrad into Russia, which means that you've got to traverse European countries, and disputes over whether they would necessarily need visas or whether they have free right of passage, things like that. Moreover, EU itself in the 90s and certainly in the 2000s became increasingly critical of Russia, despite its poor human rights record. Criticisms sort of mounted. Although, the EU's dependence on Russian energy supplies means that the criticisms were not particularly forthright. I think this is especially true when you look at the Russian-German relationship, where, as I say, Germany and other European countries have been relatively reluctant to come down too heavily too heavily against Russia. And as I say, main reason for that is that the EU, of course, remains very heavily dependent on Russian energy exports. Then we have the issue of Russia and its near abroad. The near abroad usually is thought to include countries which were once part of the Soviet Union, but can also include countries which are basically sort of post-communist, not necessarily post-Soviet, but basically post-communist. That would also include countries like Poland, Lithuania, etc., etc., etc. Hungary. So yeah, first point, this idea, and again we're sort of back to the different foreign policy approaches that Russia has followed. As I said earlier, I mean I think this is certainly true of Putin. The first point here, Russia still wants to extend its influence over post-Soviet republics. You've definitely seen that in terms of Putin's policies. Should also be said, most of the post-Soviet republics do actually have large Russian minorities. This also obviously includes the 3 Baltic republics, which were sort of incorporated into the Soviet Union in the interwar years. Actually, I say interwar years, I mean actually during the Second World War, wasn't it? Getting my history wrong there. But yes, as I say, the Baltic states have large Russian minorities, as do other post-Soviet republics. And Cotti makes the point, I think this is largely true, there's sort of been a division between various post-Soviet republics. The most liberal of these republics have generally sought closer relations with the West. These obviously include the Baltic states. Other more authoritarian republics, and this is especially true, I think, of the Stans in southern Asia, have tended to sort of continue to cooperate with Russia. Generally, if you like, the sort of more European post-Soviet republics have tended to sort of wanted to integrate themselves into Western institutions. So that would include the Baltic states, but also Georgia. Others, which, if you like, could be described as more Asian, Caucasian, some of them, I suppose, have tended, as I say, to continue to be very much located within the Russian sphere of influence. Then in the 2000s, you obviously have a series of what were known as color revolutions in various post-Soviet republics, which lead to increasing concern on the part of Putin's Russia. These begin in 2003 with Georgia's Rose Revolution, in which I think it's Shevardnadze, who was Gorbachev's foreign minister, who basically becomes the big political figure in Georgian politics in the 90s. He is sort of deposed. He too has become quite authoritarian. A new government is established there. Even more significant, of course, is the 2004 Ukrainian Orange Revolution, when again a kind of pro-Russian government basically collapses and is replaced by a more pro-Western government. Following year after that, you have in Kyrgyzstan's Rose Revolution. And similar sort of events play out, all of which leads to, I think, a growing perception inside Putin's Russia that perhaps Russian control over its near abroad, meaning post-Soviet states, that is beginning to weaken. Another point that Cotti makes in his book, though, is that you have actually seen Russia cooperate with other major powers in Central Asia. The most important of these, of course, being China. And actually, the Russian-Chinese relationship is quite interesting. I mean, ties between Russia and China. As I say, historically, Russian-Chinese relations have tended to be quite problematic. In fact, the two countries basically fall out during the Cold War and become virtual enemies in the 60s and 70s. Today, I think Russian-Chinese relations are relatively warm. I think Putin views President Xi as a potential kind of partner in terms of sort of managing Russia's relations with the West. Maybe we'll come on to that in a bit more sort of detail in a moment. But there is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes Russia, China, and also a couple of other South Asian states as well. final point, West has been generally reluctant to expand influence into the post-Soviet space. Well, I think that's true up to a point. As I say, Coty wrote this in about 2007. What you definitely do see is American influence expand into Southern Asia as a consequence of the war on terror. So a number of American military bases are established in various post-Soviet republics. Those republics quite close to Afghanistan and places like that. However, I think there was in the 2000s, I think, a sort of tacit recognition that parts of Eastern Europe and Southern Asia and the Caucasus still still fell within sort of Russia's area of control. Okay, point here, Russian weakness as a security problem. Okay, now having talked about Russia's size and its various security concerns, it's worth remembering, though, that in many ways Russia is a weak power. And I think one way of interpreting Putin's foreign policy in the last decade or so is that Putin is very anxious to try and cover up Russian weaknesses. And one way of doing that is by pursuing an assertive kind of foreign policy to try and basically hide the fact that in several very important ways, Russia is a relatively weak power. Barack Obama famously describes Russia in his 2002 presidential debate against his Republican opponent Mitt Romney. Romney basically describes Russia as America's number one geopolitical threat, and Obama responds to this by saying he disagrees and simply dismisses Russia as a regional power, not a major power on the world stage. All of which I think is correct, but whether or not it was wise for Obama to say that so publicly and so dismissively, I think is debatable. Certainly, I think Putin was sort of enraged by that sort of dismissal of Russia in such a cavalier fashion. And I think one way of sort of interpreting Russian foreign policy since 2012, is Putin trying to prove in various ways that Russia is still important, or that Russia has a capacity to cause problems. And in this regard, he has proved to be quite effective. In terms of Russian weaknesses, though, I mean, you can describe several important facts. First of all, the Russian economy. Russia might be big geographically, but in terms of the size of its economy, not that great. I checked, according to the World Bank, Russia comes in at number 11 in world rankings. So Russia is behind Britain, Italy, France, obviously Germany, India, Brazil, to name a few. And obviously far, far behind the United States and China, the two big economic superpowers in the world stage. So going back to the, relationship between Russia and China, between Putin and Xi, well, in many ways, it's a very unequal relationship. Russia is very much now the junior partner when it comes to relations with China. Actually, one other thing I would say about China is, obviously the Russian-Chinese border is in the Far East. That part of Russia is pretty empty. And what you have seen in the last decade, maybe 2 decades, is that there are increasing number of Chinese people actually kind of, overflowing, if you like, into Russia. And it's kind of potentially, I suppose it's possible that one day, that part of Russia could become increasingly sort of Chinese. So yeah, relations is be quite interesting to see, as I say, how relations between Russia and China kind of pan out in the 21st century. As I say, for the moment, Putin and Xi seem to be sort of aligned with one another, because they both have a sort of common interest in trying to limit Western influence in various parts of the world. But how easy it will be to maintain this sort of Russian-Chinese partnership in the years ahead, As I say, that I think is definitely open to question. Okay, so the Russian economy, pretty small, and as I said, very heavily reliant on its energy exports, which is not great. Governance problems, which Cody mentions, which is still very much relevant today. Corruption continues to be a major issue for Russia. Demographic decline, again, another major factor in the sense that Russian fertility collapses in the 1990s. So basically, Russians stop producing babies. And although, partly as a result of Putin's policies, that the birth rate has picked up since then, but the people, the babies born in the 1990s today, they're obviously kind of adults, and basically there aren't enough of them, to produce many, enough children, if you like. So it's sort of Russia's still living with the consequences of this sort of, as I say, fertility collapse in the 1990s. Russia faces major health problems, a health crisis. Again, going back to the parallel, I mean, in some ways, Russia, in terms of the population's health and health problems that they were experiencing, in some ways, Russia does resemble a sort of developing country. The problems it encounters not dissimilar to the sorts of problems that countries in South America, maybe even Africa, sort of experience. So, for example, AIDS in the 1990s was a major, was a major problem. Alcoholism, another sort of disease which was sort of spreading. More recently, of course, Russia has experienced big problems in sort of managing the COVID-19 epidemic. Obviously, that's not unique to Russia. Plenty of Western countries have experienced difficulties, not least Britain and America. But nonetheless, as I say, the Russian health system is under very severe problems. Crime, organized crime as well, another issue. Environmental problems, the Soviet Union environmentally was an absolute disaster area. Chernobyl, definitely, I should say, the worst example of this, but by no means the only one. And Russians today are still living with the consequences of that. Military disintegration, much of the Russian military is in a state of disrepair. I think that is true. I mean, Putin has sort of modernized bits of the Russian military, but the Russian army especially is still basically a conscript army to serve in the Russian armed forces, and the conditions in the Russian army are pretty dreadful. So there are bits of the Russian military which are pretty effective and pretty efficient, but there's other large parts of the military which which barely functions. And one of the points that Coty makes, and again I still think this is true, is that Russia has sort of become a source of soft security problems, especially I think in terms of organized crime, where the Russian mafia has sort of moved into various Western countries. Corruption to some extent has sort of feeded its way into kind of Western banks and things like that. So let's sort of bring Russia up to today. President Medvedev, who becomes president of Russia after Putin steps down. So the Russian constitution says the president can only serve 2 terms, which was problematic for Putin, obviously. He comes up with a compromise in which he basically swaps jobs with his prime minister, Medvedev, who is president for 4 years. Putin becomes Medvedev's prime minister, but who is obviously, still, to all intents and purposes, the major figure in Russian politics. However, relations with the West under Medvedev do actually sort of improve in the 4 years he is president. Medvedev appeared to be a slightly more sort of compromising figure. But I think it's fair to say that Putin, as prime minister, was not entirely happy with some of the foreign policies and security policies that Medvedev pursued. Notably, Putin kind of horrified, I think, by NATO's intervention in Libya, which Russia does not really do anything to sort of come out. Russia does not overtly come out in opposition. So, for example, Russia does not veto a UN resolution authorizing military action against Libya in 2011. So after 4 years, Putin's decided that it's time to come back, and he returns to power in 2012. And since then, I think it's fair to say that relations between Putin's Russia and the West have steadily deteriorated. I mentioned earlier that Obama sort of dismissed Russia as a regional power, which did not go down at all well in Putin's Russia. But the key moment, of course, comes in 2014 in Ukraine, where you have the Revolution of Dignity, in which, to some extent, is almost a sort of replay of the Orange Revolution in 2004. On this occasion, it's precipitated because the Ukrainian president Yanukovych decided not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. This led to sort of protests. Instead, he opted to become part of a Russian-led economic customs union. This provoked protests in Ukraine, which got steadily worse in terms of violence, and which ultimately led to a few people being killed in Kiev, and Yanukovych deciding that it was time to get out, time to leave. So again, a relatively pro-Western government, or at least let's say less pro-Russian government, if I can put it that way, comes into power in Ukraine. Putin responds by seizing the Crimean Peninsula, which historically had actually been part of Russia. It had only actually been transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev in the 1950s. Anyway, Putin seizes Crimea. It should also be said that the population in Crimea was predominantly Russian, so we're back to the sort of issue of Russian minorities in various post-Soviet countries. Putin also supports an uprising in the Donetsk region, two Ukrainian provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk. As I should say, the Donbass region, which incorporates both of these. Putin supports the uprisings in these two provinces as well, leading to a major sort of security crisis in Europe in 2014. It's the first time since the end of the Cold War that one European country forcibly seized territory from another European country. So it's seen as a sort of, very aggressive move. Lots of parallels are made to Nazi Germany's Anschluss with Austria in 1938. And the West responds by sort of imposing sanctions against Russia, so tightening the sanctions regime against Russia. Although, again, the Western response is somewhat equivocal, as we've already noted. European states are still quite heavily dependent on, Russian energy exports. So although, there is a lot of condemnation and of general feeling that some sort of support should be given to Ukraine, arguably, the European response, or the Western response in general, isn't perhaps as tough as it could have been. Putin's Russia today, then. Nice picture here, of course. One of the things that Putin likes to do in sort of classic authoritarian leader style is to have various photo shoots of him posing macho-like in various guises. This one, he's obviously out hunting in the woods, but there's plenty of photos of him sailing and riding bare-chested on horses and things like that, which apparently goes down pretty well in Russia from a Western perspective. It looks fairly odd, but there you have it. Putin's foreign policy today, then. As we've already mentioned, Putin definitely wants Russia to be viewed as an important player on the world stage. And as I say, one way of interpreting Putin's foreign certainly since 2012 when he becomes president again, is that Putin is basically trying very hard to kind of mask Russia's fairly obvious weaknesses. And one way of doing that is by, pursuing a pretty assertive foreign policy. We mentioned the fact, we mentioned the Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2014, but there have been various other actions Russia has taken. Cyber attacks against various NATO states, especially against the Baltic republics, Russian military exercises, Russian aircraft sort of testing NATO defenses, Putin sending in Russian forces into Syria, again as a way of indicating that Russia can expand its interests. Russia also has a warm water port, a very small one, but a warm water port in Syria as well, which means that Syria is seen as being quite an important strategic asset to Putin, and that's why the Russians have been fairly supportive of President Assad there. Putin also certainly views the West as a potential security threat to Russia. And again, one way of sort of interpreting Putin's response to the situation in Ukraine in 2014, one way of interpreting that is that Putin basically sees this as sort of payback for what happens in Kosovo in 1999. A third point that I think is quite significant is that, Putin wants to sort of promote Russia as an alternative model to Western liberal democracy. So, Putin is sort of trying to say, look, that Russia represents something different in terms of different to Western values. So Putin, very kind of critical of the sort of basic sort of liberal values that many Western states have, particularly when it comes to things like LGBT rights. So Putin kind of very much espousing a much more sort of socially conservative view of politics than the sort that you kind of routinely see in Western states. And as I say, Putin trying to promote Russia as an alternative to these sorts of very liberal Western values. Russia's practiced hybrid warfare as a means of weakening Western resolve. Although, again, you could interpret this as a strategy of a relatively weak state. I mean, Putin knows that in a direct military clash between Russia and NATO, that would almost certainly result in a Russian defeat. So, however, although we talk a lot about the sort of divisions inside NATO and perhaps the lack of European military spending on defense and stuff like that, which can all be interpreted as a relative, relative European weakness, nonetheless, in comparison to Russia, I mean, if it did come to a direct clash between Russian military forces and NATO military forces, there could only be one outcome. As I say, Russia is still, in military terms, and economic terms, a pretty weak state when compared to the West. So hybrid warfare, as I say, is almost a strategy of weakness. It's all about trying to use various other means to sow confusion, weaken resolve, things like that. And in this regard, you have to say Putin has been pretty successful. So various aspects to cyber warfare. One of that is obviously cyber attacks against European states and also the United States. So, Putin sort of relies very heavily on information warfare and things like that. Another aspect of this is that Putin has sort of deliberately, or Russia has sort of deliberately intervened in other countries' elections. Most spectacularly, I think, is the 2016 presidential election in the United States, where essentially Russia under Putin, organizes a sort of pro-Trump propaganda campaign. One of the reasons why I think Russia comes out so strongly in support of Trump is that basically Putin despised Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was pretty, took a pretty tough line against Putin, and been very critical on Russia's human rights record. So from Putin's perspective, Trump was a much better, was a much better candidate in terms of insofar as Russian interests were concerned. Trump openly professed to be an admirer of Putin. Trump is not a president who is going to be deeply concerned about Russia's rather problematic human rights record and things like that. And again, we can debate how much influence Russia has on the outcome of the 2016 election. But one thing that's worth noting, first of all, the result was very, very close. So it was only a few thousand votes in a handful of states that made the difference. And, it is possible that Russian activities might have tipped enough support in favor of Trump to give him the election. Of course, Trump loses the popular vote in 2016, so Hillary Clinton actually wins more votes than Trump, but Trump wins the Electoral College. So it is possible, although we can't be certain, but it is possible that Russia just sort of tipped the election. And obviously, Trump's victory is a shock result. I mean, most people are sort of expecting Clinton to win the election quite comfortably in 2016. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest something very similar could happen in 2020. That again, Russia will almost certainly be using its resources. When I say resources, of course, we mean primarily internet sources and things like that. But there's evidence that Russia has sort of did sponsor anti-Clinton protests. It sent agents into the United States to make contacts with various groups and organizations which were pro-Trump or anti-Clinton. And things like that. But above all else, it created a sort of barrage of social media posts, bots, things like that, which basically sort of propagated anti-Clinton propaganda and pro-Trump propaganda. And as I say, possibly it did have some kind of impact on the eventual outcome of that election. Also, of course, Russia has several Russian emigres who've been critical of Putin have been killed. The two kind of most spectacular cases have been several Russians living in Britain, a couple of Russians living in Britain, which were killed as a result of chemical attacks. So one example occurred in 2006 with the killing of Litvinenko, who was poisoned using, I think, polonium, so a very radioactive substance which got into his system. More recently, of course, you've had the attacks in Salisbury in 2018 when Sergei and Yulia Skripal, again, two Russians who were very critical of Putin, were killed. Attempted. They weren't killed, but almost killed in an attack involving chemical weapons. So again, and that has contributed to a very sort of marked deterioration in relations between Britain and Russia. But it also indicated that Putin felt that he could undertake these sorts of actions without actually suffering serious consequences from the international community. So it sort of reflected the more sort of assertive elements of kind of Putin's security policies. Okay, so that is Russia. I mean, going back to the original question, is Russia a security problem? I think from the perspective of 2020, it would be hard not to view Russia as a security problem. Again, we can sort of debate as to the extent to which maybe Western policies in the 90s and the early 2000s were sort of responsible for turning Russia against the West, and maybe relations were mishandled. But it is pretty evident now that Putin is clearly pursuing a much more sort of assertive policy. Although, again, just to reiterate this point one more time, in many fundamental ways, Russia is actually a pretty weak country. One thing I didn't mention, which I should have done in terms of Russian weakness, is that, in terms of its economy and in several other spheres, Russia is pretty weak, but it is still a nuclear superpower. Russia still has a very big stockpile of nuclear weapons, and that, of course, also makes it, a very significant player on the world stage. Okay, and I will bring this lecture to a conclusion on that point.